All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and author of Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org or scotthortonshow.com. I've got more than 6,000 interviews in the archive for you there going back to 2003. And follow me on all the video sites and X at Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, welcoming back to the show. This is not a rerun from a couple of weeks ago. This is a part two, in a way, of our interview with William Van Wagenen. He is an investigative journalist, and when I say investigative, I mean on the ground. He goes to the war zones and risks his own neck. And I'm so proud that the Libertarian Institute can claim quite credibly that his book is our 17th publication, Creative Chaos: Inside the CIA's Covert War to Topple the Syrian Government, just out last month at the Libertarian Institute and, of course, on Amazon.com. And this is by far the best book on Obama's dirty war in Syria and related topics. And I know that because I've read at least a whole bunch of them, though not all of them, but I can still say this is by far the best one. Welcome back to the show, William. How are you doing, man?
Hey, Scott, I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to have you here. So, now, the last time you were here, we just talked about Iraq War II the whole time because I know a lot about that, and so do you, and it's very interesting, and we kind of got lost there. There's a little bit of Iraq War II in here for context, but this book is mostly about Obama's dirty war there. And, you know, I opened up the file this afternoon to remind myself and look at this thing, and just scrolling through the table of contents, it is really something else what you've done here. It's been a little while since I reread the book, a few months anyway, but just scrolling through here and reminding myself of the scope of this thing, it is really incredible what you've done here. So I hope it's okay with you. I guess it just kind of makes sense to me that maybe I would start by asking you, who is Fareed Godri?
Well, he was a Syrian activist that lived in the United States, and he was basically recruited by the Neoconservatives, Richard Pearl, and that crowd during the Bush administration years, to basically be like the Ahmed Chalabi of Syria, you know, like a Syrian that they could basically use as like the face, you know, to say that he's speaking on behalf of Syrians, that the Syrians want to overthrow Bashar. And this guy, you know, they had this idea that they were going to put him in, overthrow the Syrian government and put him in power. And he was clearly just on the Zionist neoconservative payroll. And anyways, it's just like an early example from like the 2005, 2006 period of how they were making plans to overthrow the Syrian government. You know, when we all saw the Arab Spring erupt, it seemed like this, that it came out of nowhere, that it was spontaneous, that it was grassroots. But it turns out that there was years of planning that went into sparking that, not only in Syria, but in Tunisia, in Libya, in Yemen, in all the places where, in Egypt, all the places where it erupted. And so this guy, Ghadri, he was one of these early guys that the neoconservatives were trying to recruit to basically potentially take power in Syria if they were able to overthrow the government, just like that was kind of the plan for Ahmed Chalabi in Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
so the 2003 invasion.
Now, when you bring up Richard Pearl, obviously, and you say the neoconservatives in the vice president's office, that means Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, Scooter Libby, and David Wormser, the author of The Clean Break, which you also cite here. And I'm sorry, audience, to beat this dead horse constantly, but this seems to be at the center of a hell of a lot of American policy in this era. That's not just about we need to get rid of Saddam Hussein, although that was part of it. But the motive was because Iran helps Syria help Hezbollah. And so, and Hezbollah is a problem for the Israelis. So they said that, Wormser said, Syria was the keystone in the arch or the arc of power. I guess the arch of power between, Beirut and, or at least southern Lebanon and Tehran. And so that was, as we've discussed a million times, part of their harebrained thinking about why to get rid of Saddam Hussein, because that would give them power over the Iraqi Shia, and the Iraqi Shia would then lord it over the Iranians and Hezbollah and everybody else. But then, as Wormser wrote in Coping with Crumbling States, the companion piece, we want to expedite the chaotic collapse to Syria. And so I only state all that to ask you, am I overstating it then, or am I being too simplistic to say that, yeah, that's what we're talking about here, this is the same old neoconservative doctrine based on essentially Likud doctrine, saying that Iran and their Shiite alliance in the region is too powerful, and particularly in regards, as I'm saying here, in regards to Iran backing Hezbollah by way of Syria. And so is that what this all boils down to? Is the same old cranks with their same old ridiculous schemes?
Yeah, basically. So the motivation to topple the Syrian government in 2011 was basically the same motivation to topple Saddam in 2003. And as you mentioned, David Wormser, he talked about dividing up Iraq and Syria into these like ethnic, tribal, clan-based states. Again, in Syria, you'd have an small Alawite state, a Sunni state, a Druze state. In Iraq, you'd have a Sunni state in the west, Kurdish state in the north, Shia state in the south. And the Israelis, they feared large Arab armies. So that's what Saddam had. So that was one reason he had to go. And that's what the Syrians had. That's what Hafiz al-Assad had. And then later Bashar, they had, pretty large armies. Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad had chemical weapons. So it was a part of this process that the neoconservatives spearheaded on behalf of Israel to remake the Middle East. And, again, it also goes back to the same things, again, your listeners, I'm sure, aware of, where Wesley Clark said, there was this plan in the Pentagon driven by the Israelis to topple 7 governments in 5 years. This was this plan to remake the Middle East, and all of the Iraq War in 2003, plus the Syria operation was all part of that. And again, it took them a few extra years to do Syria, but the planning to do it, went back to this period of like 2000, right after 9/11, again, as we mentioned, with that plan that Wesley Clark revealed. And then also, the planning they did in subsequent years as the Iraq War operation was going on. So they were trying to do Syria earlier, like 2007, 2008, but it just took them a few extra years to pull it off, is what it appears like.
Yeah. All right. So now, this is kind of a parenthesis, but can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Alawites and the Shiites and exactly how that works? I mean, we don't have to get deep into the religious context, but at least a little bit. And then also the relationship between these sects inside the country.
Yeah, so Alawites are an offshoot of Shia Islam, I guess you would say. And Bashar al-Assad, the former Syrian president, was Alawite. Hafiz al-Assad was Alawite. And they're a minority in Syria. And this has created a weakness that the U.S. and Israel were able to exploit, because there's an intense hostility against Alawites, also against Druze, the majority of whom live in southern Syria. There's intense hostility towards them on the part of like extremist Salafi Muslims, of the sort that Saudi Arabia supports, of the sort that stalk the ranks of Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and groups like this, where they view Alawites as apostates who should be killed and their women enslaved and their property taken. And the Salafists go back to religious edicts or fatwas that were issued by a medieval Islamic scholar named Ibn Taymiyyah. The Salafists, they always say, we're trying to follow exactly what the Prophet Muhammad did and what his companions did. We're trying to emulate them. But in reality, they just listen to everything that Ibn Taymiyyah says, and he lived, a couple hundred years later in Damascus, and he was issuing these religious rulings saying that Alawites, should be killed because they're apostates. So when the U.S. and Israel wanted to try to destroy Syria, one way to do that, again, is just to play on these sectarian differences and to create hatred between the different religious groups. And as I mentioned, David Wormser, this was his idea, was to, divide up Iraq and Syria into these ethnic or religious-based mini-statelets, so there just wouldn't be powerful Arab armies that could challenge Israel. So having sponsoring groups like Al-Qaeda, full of these Salafist religious extremists who have this hatred for Alawites, funding those groups, giving them weapons, that was, the method, and trying to, trigger a sectarian war. That was the method to do that. And it was the method in Iraq as well, in my opinion, at least, because in my view, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was being supported by the U.S. and Israel, as we talked about in the last interview. And that was the way to create problems in Iraq, as you have these extremist Sunnis who were saying that the Shia are apostates and the Shia should all be killed. And again, that was the big weakness that Syria has, is this ethnic or religious diversity. It's easy to create cleavages and create sectarian wars by encouraging that type of ideology, like Ibn Taymiyyah's Salafist ideology, and then also giving those people weapons and guns and having them go kill people, and then doing false flag type killings, blaming them on the Alawite quote unquote government, even though there are many Sunnis in the Syrian government, in the army and the security forces too. But those are the ways to really destroy a country,
So now, I mean, obviously the Ba'athist regime there was a police state. I don't know, how you rank it on the gray scale of authoritarianism, but I wonder, is it fair to say, do you think, that it really did represent, and because the Alawites, I believe, are 10% of the population, not that every Alawite was part of the ruling regime, of course, but just it's a small minority of the population sitting on top of this police state. So then, but is it, I mean, obviously it's not just completely top-down power, because that's not how power works. Saddam Hussein was ruthless, but still he had to balance all kinds of relationships in order to maintain his grip, So is it fair then to say that the Alawite regime before the intervention represented at least something like a consensus between obviously the Alawites themselves, but then the Shiites, the Druze, the Kurds, and even the majority Sunni Arabs? I know that, for example, Pepe Escobar, who I don't really put a lot of stock in what he says, I'm sorry to say, no offense, but I do believe him about this, though, that he said, look, man, in Aleppo, this was at the time, it was here in Aleppo, the Sunni middle class has no interest in a bin Ladenite revolution whatsoever, right? They're stuck in the middle of this whole thing. And so, but that doesn't necessarily translate to everybody liked it the way it was or whatever. But I just wonder if you can give us, basically the temperature on the degree of support for the regime before Obama came to town.
Yeah. So, the Syrian government under Bashar, like in 2010, and Bashar himself, from everyone I've talked to in Syria, which is a lot of people, they all say that Bashar was pretty popular and that life was actually quite good here in Syria. The average person who had a job could buy a car, could get an apartment, had the money to get married. Syria didn't have a huge population, but it's a very rich country. There, given the size of the population, it has a lot of oil, a lot of really good land for growing wheat up in the northeast, which is now under U.S. and Kurdish occupation. And then in Latakia, there's a lot of agriculture there. And Latakia on the coast, and the mountains on the coast, is where most of the Alawites live, and a lot of them are extremely poor. So if you go to these villages up in the mountains in Latakia, Alawites are very poor, and the only opportunities they really had to make any money was farming, which provided some income, and then also to go into the army and into the security forces. So they did have, outsized influence in the security forces. But at the same time, like you said, both Hafiz and Bashar, they had to balance that with this, the Sunni population, because their numbers were very big. They had to keep the Sunnis happy, and most of the people in Syria that had money were Sunnis. Like, again, the merchant class in Aleppo, the merchant class in Damascus. These were the people that really had the money, and they even viewed going into the army and the security forces as like something that wouldn't be a respectable thing to do. Kind of like, liberals in New York City now would never join the U.S. military. Is kind of the same thing. So the Sunnis in Damascus and Aleppo, they had the most money in the country, and so they had power from that, and then that was balanced out with Alawites having more influence in the army and the security forces. But again, a lot of the ministers, including when the war broke out and throughout the war, a lot of them were Sunnis. So this is a
wasn't it the
big
case,
lie.
William, that the majority of the actual Syrian Arab army were obviously, I mean, not obviously, but maybe not surprisingly, because of the makeup of the country, they were Sunni Arabs, right? And even the whole time throughout the war, even as they're fighting against this Salafi-based, the radical edge of the Sunni-based insurgency, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there were times when, some of the opposition activists would acknowledge that. I can't remember the exact reference, but there's quite a few articles of interviews I've come across with opposition activists where they would say, well, this is kind of, what no one admits, but the thing keeping Bashar's regime intact or afloat, in the middle of the war was all the Sunni support for it. And as you mentioned, in Aleppo, the merchant class, like Aleppo was one of the last cities where they were starting to have protests. And when the quote unquote rebels, the Free Syrian Army, and also the Nusra Front, the Al Qaeda offshoot, when they actually took over parts of Aleppo in the summer of 2012, the majority Sunni population did not welcome them at all. And even the FSA and Nusra commanders acknowledged that. They would say things like, they in various interviews, they, even in mainstream papers, I remember there's one interview with The Guardian where they were basically saying, look, 75% or 70% of people in Aleppo are against us. And all the rebels, so-called rebels, most of them were from the countryside, and the people in the cities were like, we don't like these people. In addition to that, these rebel groups were being controlled by, in Aleppo, for example, they were mostly being controlled by Turkish intelligence. And these rebel groups would come into Aleppo and come into the old markets, which are really, really famous, like around the Citadel in Aleppo. And they burned all the markets, and they put a bunch of explosives in the markets and detonated them and destroyed these famous markets in Aleppo, looted a bunch of the shops. And basically, from people I've talked to, they feel like Turkish intelligence was trying to destroy the economic base in Aleppo on purpose, again, just to create chaos in the country and to weaken Bashar's rule.
Mm-hmm.
And they were really bitter about that. A lot of the old city of Aleppo was destroyed by these rebels by doing these huge digging tunnels, or being in the tunnels underneath the old city and detonating these huge explosives and destroying a bunch of these, areas that were, 1,000, 2,000 years old. In addition to that, all the factories were looted by Nusra and the Free Army, and all the equipment was hauled off to Turkey. So it was kind of like a big, massive looting operation that these so-called rebels undertook in Aleppo. And the people who lost all of their income and their businesses, and the economy was destroyed. These were all Sunnis in Aleppo who hated the rebels. Of course, there were some Sunnis that did support them in the more conservative areas, again, where Salafism is stronger, and there's areas of Aleppo like that. There's certain neighborhoods. So it wasn't 100%, but as these rebel commanders themselves acknowledged, maybe 70% of people in Aleppo, which is majority Sunni, did not like them and didn't welcome them into the city.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, so I want to get back to Godry. I brought him up for a reason. We're going to get back to, Obama years and all of this. It's such a complicated story, but I wanted to go back and ask you about Hama in 82, because you write about this, and this is when Bashar al-Assad, I guess, was still an ophthalmologist in England, or training to be one, and his father, Hafiz al-Assad, was the dictator then, and there was a giant uprising in Hama, and Eric Margulies and Patrick Coburn were both there and reported on the thing. Now, I don't know what the official casualty numbers were, but it was something like 10,000 or more people were killed when the government put down this insurrection by the Muslim Brotherhood, or at least that's the very simple version of the story for setup question purposes anyway. Feel free to talk all about that. But then also, if you could please explain, in your estimation, what it all means and how important it is. And I'm just reminded of doing the show way back, talking with Eric Margulies probably 20 years ago, and him telling that story and me asking him, so then if the neocons get what they want and they overthrow the government in Damascus, then other than the Ba'athists, who in Syria is organized and prepared to inherit the power and take over the country? And whether it was his words or mine, I don't remember. Probably it was Margulies that said, yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood, if you're lucky, maybe bin Ladenites, right? Maybe far worse than that. So yeah, these neocons would be crazy to pursue this now. And I'm sorry, this is a long, complicated question, but you're smart and know about this stuff. So then part of that gets to the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood, where, in Qatar, they sit in the parliament, and in Egypt, they're basically rich old men, not young radicals, or at least they were back before, the Arab Spring and the aftermath of that, etc. But I guess my understanding was that in Syria, they really were a lot closer to the bin Ladenites, and maybe their leaders had fought in Afghanistan in the 80s and that kind of thing, or not, if you could address that. But then I just want to say one more, launch one more dig at David Wormser here, where he wrote in The Clean Break that, and this is right in the aftermath of the Khobar Towers attack, and he's saying, well, fundamentalist terrorism in the region is a problem, but America will just have to find better allies against fundamentalism than the Baathists, which is just like, I guess, a moral condemnation of Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad or whatever. But the point being that at the time that they're carrying out this policy in Syria now, when we bring it back up to contemporary times in your book, this is after September 11th, and this is after, even if the entire, bin Ladenite insurgency was an inside job, as you say, run through the Kurds and all that, as you have concluded here, that still they were the bleeding edge of the Sunni insurgency that killed 4,000 out of the 4,500 guys of American soldiers that died in Iraq, soldiers and Marines that died in Iraq. So you would think that the logic that, well, yeah, bin Ladenite terrorism is bad, but the Baathists are worse, would have been made null and void by 2009 and 2011 when Barack Obama is coming into power and launching this policy. So I know that's a lot to handle, but I'm now going to turn off my microphone and listen to you talk for a while.
Okay, well, I guess the important thing to remember is that the Muslim Brotherhood, from its earliest days, was like a creation of British intelligence. And, for that reason, it's not surprising that in the 1980s, which Mark Curtis writes about a lot, in the 1980s, the center of like the Islamic fundamentalist world was London. They used to call it Londonistan. And even bin Laden had an office there, almost bought a house in London. So the Muslim Brotherhood is, again, you need to see it as a creation of Western intelligence, specifically British. And so, for example, when you move ahead to the Arab Spring, which again seemed like this grassroots revolution, peaceful protests, etc., against these Arab dictators, it was actually the result, again, of a policy of the Obama administration, because in September 2010, the Obama administration brought together officials from the CIA, from the National Security Council, from the State Department, from the tech companies like Facebook, and they had a series of meetings about what to do with these aging Arab dictators, both ones that were, maybe not us and ones that were. And they developed a strategy for what they called initiating democratic transitions. And they issued a document called Presidential Study Directive 11. And it was later reported on in the Washington Post and in the New York Times. Basically, Presidential Study Directive 11 said the U.S. policy was to help topple these governments, including governments friendly to the U.S., like in Egypt, in order to control the transitions to more democratic or popular regimes or governments. But specifically, the goal was to put the Muslim Brotherhood in power in all those different countries where the so-called Arab Spring broke out. So it was the policy to topple bin Ali in Tunisia, replace him with the Ennahda party. It was the policy to topple Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen and replace him with the Islah party, which was Muslim Brotherhood. And the Ennahda party in Tunisia was Muslim Brotherhood. And then it was the policy to depose Mubarak and replace him with the Muslim Brotherhood party in Egypt. And then it was the policy again to topple Bashar al-Assad and try to replace him with the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And, all of these exiled opposition groups, like the Syrian National Council, they had this kind of secular veneer, but all of that organization was basically full of Muslim Brotherhood guys. So anyways, that's the point, is that the Muslim Brotherhood are agents of the US, Britain, Israel. So if you go all the way back to what happened in Hama in 1982, it was basically the same thing that the US and Israel were trying to do to Hafiz al-Assad that they tried to do to Bashar many decades later. So basically, the US, Jordan, Israel, they were giving weapons to the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria in the 1970s and encouraging them to launch an insurgency against Hafiz al-Assad. So this began in 1979. There was a famous case of the officer school in Aleppo, where the Muslim Brotherhood carried out a massacre of these Alawite officer cadets in the Aleppo Artillery School, if I remember the name right. And then there was this series of assassinations against Syrian government officials. There was an attempt to assassinate Hafiz al-Assad himself. And the people behind it were from a group called the Fighting Vanguard, which was just an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time was a guy named Saeed Hawa. And he very strongly advocated the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah that I mentioned earlier, saying that Alawites are apostates and they should be killed. So the Muslim Brotherhood, and then their basically like armed wing, the Fighting Vanguard, they launched this insurgency against the Syrian government in 1979. And then that's what led to the events in Hama 3 years later in 1982, where the Muslim Brotherhood and the Fighting Vanguard had collected a ton of weapons in Hama, and they launched like an insurrection, took over a bunch of police stations, carried out a bunch of assassinations, and were trying to basically take over Hama. And then that's when Hafiz al-Assad, came with the army and tried to crush the insurgency. And regarding the casualties, it's just unknown. The Muslim Brotherhood, they say like 20,000 people were killed, and they say they were all civilians. But there was this armed insurgency going on, and they had weapons from the U.S. and from Israel, and they're the ones that launched the attack and launched the insurgency to take over Hama, and then Hafez al-Assad sent the army in response. There was, I believe it was a Defense Intelligence Agency document that was written shortly after that claimed that the number of casualties was 2,000. So I don't know exactly how many people were killed. I have been to Hama, and I've talked to people that were there during that time, and they said the bombing from the Syrian army was really bad. So it's not to say anyway. So it was definitely a very bloody affair. But it was the things that happened in Hama and what led to that. Regardless of whether you feel like maybe it was only 2,000 people who died, mostly Muslim Brotherhood militants, or whether it was 20,000 people and they were all civilians, it was the result of this U.S., Israeli, UK effort to use the Muslim Brotherhood to overthrow the Syrian government way back in the late 70s and early 80s. And it's just like they just did the exact same playbook, however many, 30-ish years later. And there's even a CIA document that I mentioned in the book that describes a plan to try to topple the Syrian government at that time. And it even says that the U.S., the CIA would establish committees of free Syrians, and that they would launch an insurrection from a city called Deraa in southern Syria, just across the border from Jordan, with help from Jordan. And I can't remember when that document was issued, but I think it was like back in the 70s. And it just describes like the exact same thing they did in 2010. The so-called protest movement started in Deraa in just across the Jordanian border in 2011, and they established the Free Syrian Army. I mean, they even used the exact same language. So again, this is all evidence that what happened in 2011 was not a grassroots uprising, peaceful uprising against a dictator, but this was all engineered by the CIA, again, for the purpose of benefiting the Israelis, using the Muslim Brotherhood as their tool to do it. Mm-hmm. And, back in the days, I'm sure you remember this, but like there was constantly, anytime you would bring up, when I first started writing for you at the Libertarian Institute, and you'd get in these arguments with these people on Twitter that were big Syrian activists and things like that, or Westerners that became activists for the opposition. Basically, they were mostly getting paid, but they would constantly say, "Oh, that's a conspiracy theory that the CIA is involved in these protests, and you're just denying the agency of Syrians, and you think that." They're just not capable of having any agency and doing anything on their own, and on and on and on. It was just, but if you just look at it, there's so much evidence that this was a plan. And, again, they took that playbook from the 70s and the 80s that culminated in what happened in Hama. And again, there's the Presidential Study Directive 11 from the Obama administration that's openly said, look, we're trying to put the Muslim Brotherhood in power in all these countries. And then these people would come out and just say that, you need to listen to Syrians because, and it's like, oh, well, which Syrians are you listening to? You're listening to the Syrians who are being paid by the U.S. government, who are saying these are peaceful protests that that the CIA or any foreign intelligence agencies had nothing to do with, and Obama and the U.S. only got involved later, because Bashar was killing all these people for no reason. And that's when the U.S. finally reluctantly intervened, and these activists were blaming the Obama administration for its inaction and all this stuff. And the whole thing was just orchestrated by the U.S., Israel, Britain, etc. from the beginning. And anyways, that's what the book is about. If people want the evidence of all this, it's in the book. So.
Yeah. All right. So a few things there. First of all, when I talk about the Muslim Brotherhood there, and even bringing up the old stuff and bringing up Iraq War II and the role of Al-Qaeda in Iraq there and this and that, I don't mean to sound naive, and apologies for the experienced in the audience, but then again, there are new people in the audience all the time who maybe don't have a background in this thing. And so it's worth pointing out that when David Wormser says, no way, I prefer fundamentalists to Baathists, that only a traitor could still say that in 2011. These people knew exactly what they were doing. There's no question that, somehow in 2014 or 17, they looked back and went, geez, I guess those guys were jihadists after all, or something like that. Like, they knew exactly what they were doing, because we knew exactly what they were doing at the time. And so that's the point of going back over all of that stuff. Now on the,
and I guess the biggest, maybe the final thing, the biggest evidence of that is that, throughout the war, again, the U.S., Israel, Britain, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi, they were supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and they were supporting ISIS, but they constantly claimed they weren't. They constantly claimed, these people are terrorists and they're our enemies. But they were supporting him. Again, you can read the book to see the documentation of that. But when Jolani, the leader of the Nusra Front, took over Syria back in December, and the whole CIA operation to topple the Bashar al-Assad's government was finally successful. The name of the CIA operation is Timber Sycamore. When the Timber Sycamore operation was finally successful last December, toppled Bashar al-Assad, and Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, a former Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Islamic State in Iraq commander, and then Nusra Front commander, which was the official Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. When he came to power in December, nobody missed a beat. Nobody even raised an eyebrow. The Brits immediately recognized him. The Americans immediately recognized him. The Israelis kind of acted like they weren't that happy about it, so they could still kind of use, his terrorist past, against him if they need to get some concessions, like maybe having him give up the Golan Heights, etc. But they just, they didn't even bother to even acknowledge, we launched this whole huge war because terrorism was so bad, and the terrorism and ISIS and Al-Qaeda was such a threat to our civilization. And then they just stick a former ISIS commander in as the president of Syria, immediately get rid of the $10 million bounty within a couple months. He's meeting President Trump in Saudi Arabia, and they're just shaking hands. Again, after Trump went on those tirades during the 2006 election, blaming Hillary Clinton for supporting ISIS and all these things, which is true. And then he just turns around and, has this nice meeting with them and says, this guy, Shera, they changed his name to rebrand him. The British did. And Trump is there shaking his hand and giving interviews afterwards saying this is a tough guy, nice guy, good looking guy. That's the indication that this whole thing going back, decades about Al-Qaeda claiming there's a war on terror. To me, that's there's many evidences of it, but that's a big evidence to me that they could have a former ISIS commander take power in Syria, and they just act like nothing even happened, and they just welcome him with open arms. That's just a big sign to me.
All right. Well, now, so let's go back to the Arab Spring there for a second, because first of all, Liz Cheney was part of this. I remember Sean Hannity ranting at her during the Arab Spring, when, I guess, kind of in the aftermath, when the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections in Egypt. And he has Liz Cheney as a guest, and he's ranting, who's responsible for this? And he doesn't understand that she is. That when she was working at the State Department, this was her big deal, was creating sort of the next step for what are we going to do, because they knew that Hosni Mubarak's son was sort of an ineffectual type and would not be capable of inheriting the power. I guess they were having trouble deciding on a military dictator to succeed him. And so they were essentially experimenting with the idea of having free elections, or at least rigged elections, and some kind of transformation toward democracy in Egypt. And you could say, there's a little bit of Robert Kaganism that let's try it in there, that they actually believe in democracy a little bit or something. It's part of their weird ideology. But I guess my take at the time, it seemed pretty clear going back from covering it at the time, was that the whole thing had gotten out of hand. That I'm not exactly sure what happened in Tunisia. That was also America's guy that got overthrown. But once the protests broke out in Egypt, it didn't seem like just a put on, because it seemed like you had the entire population of Alexandria, Giza, and Cairo all just out in the street, and right wing and left wing, all the students and all the government workers and all the, so-called liberals from the big cities, and then also the Muslim Brotherhood, with the encouragement of Qatar and Al Jazeera, admittedly, of course. But not at first, though. And then they just barely won the elections. Oh, and I should say that during the thing, it was very clear the Obama people said they were doing everything they could to keep Mubarak in there, and they wanted to even ease him out if they had to and replace him with Omar Suleiman, the head of the secret police. And that they were terrified about elections and this revolution. They want to keep him as long as possible. So then I guess what I'm saying is I'm questioning how certain it is that what happened in Egypt was exactly what they had planned, because then even once the Muslim Brotherhood did take power, they just barely won the elections, and then the entire government refused to work with them, basically. Like, they just did like work slowdowns essentially, and refused to, like Donald Trump trying to run DC, back 8 years ago. And then Saudi Arabia and America and Israel sponsored a military coup to overthrow the Muslim Brotherhood and put the military dictator back in power after only a year and a half, and a fake little protest movement to justify it. And it seemed to me like, I don't know. And I guess this goes to the question overall, what you say too about Al Qaeda. And there's just no question that US, UK, and Saudi back these jihadis all over the place. I guess at this point, I'm the kook for saying, I'm the conspiracy theorist for saying maybe there's some wiggle room in there where these people do things that they're not made to do by MI6, but maybe I'm the nut at this point for that.
Well, going back to, the question about Egypt and Tunisia, it was the same. Again, that was a big thing. People would say, well, how could the U.S. be behind the protests in Tunisia and Egypt, because these are U.S. allies, and we all know from reading Noam Chomsky that the U.S. loves supporting dictators. So of course the U.S. couldn't be behind these protests, right?
Well,
but again, we know from.
But hang on one second, because I know that what happened in Tunisia was that it was a huge scandal from the WikiLeaks that detailed the corruption of the government there that was put out, and that wasn't an inside job. That was Bradley Manning and Julian Assange who did that. And it just showed State Department flunkies talking to each other about Ben Ali's, especially his wife's family's, total kleptocracy in the country. And then right on the heels of that scandal that was, boiling all through the end of 2010, was then that guy, Boulazizi, set himself on fire in protest of the cops confiscating his vegetable cart. And then the riots broke out. So if the NED kicked into gear then, I don't know about it, and I'm perfectly willing to listen. But that part of it wasn't rigged by the CIA. You know what I mean? That part of it was like, oh shit, things are breaking out in Tunisia. You know what I mean?
Well, I think it was rigged by the CIA. Let me try to explain why. The first thing, again, if you know about those meetings of the National Security Council, State Department, CIA in September 2010, where they issue a document stating that it's U.S. policy to overthrow all these Arab governments and replace them with Muslim Brotherhood political parties, then you have to say, okay, that was a few months before everything broke out in Tunisia. So all of a sudden, WikiLeaks released these cables about, the corruption of the president, Ben Ali. What's weird is that when those cables got released, WikiLeaks, this is all in English, right? So how quickly is that going to really filter into like Tunisian society potentially and like cause all these big problems? And like, did people in Tunisia not really know he was corrupt? I mean, they probably did. But there was also a group of Tunisians based in France, Tunisian activists, that were prepared, like within 1 hour of WikiLeaks releasing the cables about Ben Ali and his corruption, there was a group of Tunisians based in France who had their own website, translated. They had already sifted through the cables. They translated them. They summarized them, and they disseminated the cables in Arabic. So they were like provided all this information by WikiLeaks in advance, and did all the work of curating them, again translating them into Arabic, and then disseminating them online for Tunisians to actually be upset about. But the fact that seems very, very organized, and it seems like
you're saying Assange gave it to them in advance of publishing it on the site. You're saying Assange gave it to them early compared to the public?
Yeah. So there was this whole group of Tunisian activists, but they are based in France, who got the cables early and were able to release them basically 1 hour after WikiLeaks publicly released them on their website. So
where can I read about that? Is that in the book?
I'll send you the references.
Okay.
And then, but then the crazy thing too is that, as you mentioned, there was this young vegetable seller, Mohammed Bouazizi, who lit himself on fire. And people say this was the reason, that then the protests snowballed and got very big. But in addition to that, there were, and this doesn't barely get talked about, but there's an Al Jazeera journalist who wrote about this, that there were snipers who were executing protesters, shooting them, in the back of the head in some of these early protests. And no one knew who these snipers were. Bin Ali and the government, of course, denied that they were from the government side, but everyone assumed that, it must be snipers from the government. And they were killing all these protesters. And then as soon as all these protesters started getting killed, Obama immediately came out publicly and said, Bin Ali has lost legitimacy, so he needs to go. It's like, okay, well, that might sound a little bit crazy that the U.S. might have deployed false flag snipers to kill protesters and have, and make sure that the protests snowballed and that the hatred against the government grew. But we all know what happened in Ukraine at the Maidan in 2014. That's exactly what happened. And on top of that, the same sniper phenomenon migrated like clockwork also to Egypt. There were false flag snipers in Egypt. There were false flag snipers in Yemen. There were false flag snipers in early protests in Libya. And there were false flag snipers killing protesters and members of the security forces in Syria in the early protests. So knowing that there is this Presidential Study Directive 11, that the policy was to overthrow these governments and replace them with the Muslim Brotherhood, indicates that this was an operation, including in Tunisia. And, that's why here I'm the kook, I'm the crazy one. That's why I think, to be honest, WikiLeaks is, an operation of the Israelis. And there's even a quote in maybe it's the Time of Israel, I'd have to dig it up, but there's a quote where in an Israeli newspaper, they say, if WikiLeaks didn't exist, Israel would have to create it. And in the Israeli press, there's lots of articles where they talk about WikiLeaks never released anything that harmed Israeli national security. In other cases, it actually helped them, in a few cases. And there's other things about Julian Assange that I need to research it better to properly make the case, because probably your listeners now already think I'm crazy. But the whole thing in Tunisia, there's all these clear indications from, again, Obama administration setting this policy, to the WikiLeaks cables coming out, to them being already ready to go, translated and disseminated by this group of Tunisians that are based in the West, and then having these false flag snipers come, kill protesters to make sure that the hatred for the government would grow, and would give Obama the excuse to immediately come out and say that Bin Ali had lost legitimacy. And again, the same thing happened in Egypt. The Obama administration said they're constantly acting like, we want to keep Mubarak, he's our friend. But they have to act that way. If they were to come out and say, we support, the Arab Spring, or we sparked the Arab Spring, that would immediately blow the cover on the whole thing. It would lose legitimacy, So they had to kind of play it off like, we're not involved in this. We're supporting Mubarak. But again, a couple days after a bunch of snipers killed some protesters near the Ministry of Interior in Cairo, in January, just after in the first couple of days of the protests, Obama sent like a special envoy to Cairo, and he told Mubarak to step down. I feel bad, I can't remember the name, but Obama sent like a special envoy, flew him to Cairo, and they privately told him, Mubarak, in a meeting, hey, you need to step down. And there's some other indications, again, that in Egypt, this was all planned as well. So, for example, in like 2009, 2010, the State Department, under the guidance of a guy named Jared Cohen, who initially started working for Condoleezza Rice, and then stayed on when Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State. Jared Cohen and the State Department, along with Facebook, Google, etc., they were organizing conferences for activists from all these different Arab countries and from Iran. They were having, conferences in Beirut. They were having conferences in New York. They would fly these Arab activists and human rights people to these conferences, teach them how to use Facebook, teach them how to use Twitter in order to spark protests. This is color revolution stuff, right, that we see in all the former Soviet places, including in Serbia. These guys were actually being trained by Otpor, the Serbian activist group that sparked the demonstrations against Milosevic. So Otpor was training these different people. They're learning how to use all this technology. They're also learning how to use Tor, this this way to keep your internet searches and communication secret, which Edward Snowden always promotes. And that's how WikiLeaks supposedly were able to get their earliest documents and then release them, was through this software called Tor. But Tor was funded by the U.S. government. This was a U.S. Military project to create this technology, Tor. So anyways, Jared Cohen in the State Department, he was organizing all of these activists, training them. And then what they would do is they would find ways, find grievances that they could lock onto in a particular country, promote those grievances, and then try to again create anger against the government. So in the case of Egypt, the way they did it was there was this a young guy named Khalid Said, who was beaten to death by the Egyptian police for being like a low-level drug dealer. So some of these activists, again with heavy involvement from a guy named Wa'al Ghanem, who worked for Google, this guy, a Google employee, he's the one that created the We Are All Khalid Said Facebook page. And from that Facebook page, which was created in, I'd have to double check the date again, but it was like, late 2010 or like beginning of January, they promoted the case of Khalid Said, who had been killed probably 9 months before. And they got a bunch of, followers on Facebook. I'm sure they got some help, being promoted by the algorithm. And then they were able to start the initial protests. And when the first protest broke out, this guy, Wa'al Ghanem, he was working for Google, but in an office in Dubai. He was in Egypt at the time the protests broke out, just by chance, of course. And guess who he met in Egypt, in Cairo, when the protests were going? He had a meeting with Jared Cohen. Jared Cohen showed up. Again, the guy from the State Department. And this guy, Jared Cohen, he later went on to work for Google. And anyway, through these different things, you can see that all of this stuff was orchestrated. So the average Egyptian that's maybe going down to Tahrir Square in Cairo and is angry, for good reasons in many cases, corruption, poverty, lack of democracy, all this stuff. But what the average person doesn't know is who actually organized these protests. Who are these technology companies helping facilitate them? Who are the activists, and who are they being paid by? And what is the purpose of these demonstrations? Is it really, to help Egyptians, or is there some, broader outside agenda at work here? So anyways, that sniper phenomenon too, again, it started in Tunisia, and the exact same thing happened in Cairo. The exact same thing happened in Libya. The exact same thing happened in Libya or in Yemen, sorry. And then the exact same thing happened in Egypt. And I wrote a paper about it that I need to send to you to publish. I haven't published anything on it, but I've written it. So I'll send that to you if you want to know about the sniper stuff. But again, it's just the exact same playbook that we later saw in 2014 in Ukraine, which again sounds kind of crazy, maybe, that a bunch of protesters were actually killed by people from their own side. But in the Ukraine case, it's like documented so clearly by Ivan Kachanovsky, the Ukrainian professor that teaches in Ottawa in Canada. And a lot of people are familiar with what happened in the Maidan, but that was the exact same tactics, the exact same stuff happened in all the Arab Spring countries. And so, again, this all indicates that these were intelligence operations from the beginning to basically create protests and help them snowball and create anger against the government to topple these leaders. And then when it migrated finally to Syria in March of 2011. The U.S. Intelligence, Israelis, et cetera, they not only sparked protests in that way, like they had in Tunisia and Egypt, et cetera, but they also, as we talked about in the last interview, they also released a bunch of guys, Islamic State guys from prison in Iraq, and sent them to Syria. Those guys were there in Syria waiting to launch the insurgency in late 2010. We know that from an American journalist, Theo Padnos, who was abducted by the Nusra Front and held prisoner by them for 2 years. So he had tons of chances to talk with Nusra fighters, with ISIS guys. And they all told him, like, look, we all came from Iraq and we were, in eastern Syria and ready to launch this insurgency to topple Bashar because he was an Alawite. And we were, preparing for that even before these, protests broke out in Deraa in March. Anyways, sorry, that's a very long answer, but hope that all makes sense.
Yeah, nah, that's good. Hang on just one second for me. Hey, you guys, this October, Mikkel Thorup is once again hosting the free Expat Money Online Summit this October 10th through 12th. Thorup is a great dude. How do I know? Well, I toured ancient Mayan ruins with him in Mexico one time. It was rad. He's a serious expert in residency and citizenship laws and customs around the world. He knows it all, chapter and verse, where you can put your money and put yourself anywhere in the world you might want to go. He can show you how to acquire second residencies and other real estate, get foreign citizenship, legally mitigate taxes, set up offshore banking, and more. This year's summit is focused on Latin America. Mikkel and other top-tier experts will help you build your offshore Plan B and understand the geopolitical forces reshaping the region. Head over to expatmoneysummit.com to reserve your free ticket today. That's expatmoneysummit.com. Hang on just one second for me here. You guys, I'm so proud to announce the publication of the Libertarian Institute's 14th book. It's Israel, winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War, Undue Influence, Deceptions, and the Neocon Energy Agenda by Gary Vogler, former senior oil consultant and deputy senior oil advisor for U.S. forces during Iraq War II. Remember how I wrote in Enough Already about how Ahmed Chalabi sold the neoconservatives on a plan to rebuild the old British oil pipeline from Mosul and Kirkuk, Iraq, to Haifa, Israel, if they would only get the United States to overthrow Saddam Hussein for him? And how they bought it because they are as dumb as they are corrupt? Well, Gary was there. As senior civilian consultant to the DoD and Iraqi oil ministry, he had a unique window and experience witnessing the Pentagon neocons and their machinations on behalf of Israel before and during that war. And it turns out that even though they did not get their pipeline, as Vogler demonstrates, the neocons and their Likudnik bosses figured out an effective Plan B anyway. You are going to love Israel, winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War by Gary Vogler, available everywhere. Check it out along with our other great books at libertarianinstitute.org/books. Well, those of you who listen to me tell you to listen to Mike Swanson at Wall Street Window and Tim Fry at Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. Have bought a bunch of gold, must be doing great right now, and should probably donate to the Libertarian Institute. Robertson Roberts is the best. It's a matter of trust. There's no flashy gimmicks, risky schemes, or bait-and-switch scams here. Robertson Roberts is here to help you protect your wealth. Any portfolio ought to have a solid percentage in metals. For us Austrian school types, even more. Go to Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. at rrbi.co to protect yourself for monetary inflation. That's rrbi.co. Hey, listen, so a few things there. I guess it's possible that I have to reassess my take on the Arab Spring, which was mostly that they had begun to do this color-coded type project and then had tried to call it off in order to save their guy in Egypt too late. And that, of course, they exploited it in Libya and Syria to the absolute nth degree. They didn't really know what to do in Yemen and eventually ended up just trying to ease the guy out and put the vice president in there, which, of course, blew up in their face. But then in Saudi Arabia, they clamped down hard on the Shiites and I guess gave increased welfare payments to everybody else, which they did the same thing, basically with bribes in Kuwait, in Iraq. They had kind of day of rage protests, but they didn't really go anywhere. I don't know. I guess the Sunnis didn't have any real power in Baghdad, and everybody else was settling for good enough by then. But it seemed like kind of a phenomenon that went beyond what the National Endowment for Democracy was capable of even trying to rig. And it seemed to me like, well, yeah, they exploit it where they can and clamp down on it. Oh, in Bahrain, the Americans sat silent and even avowedly approvingly, as the Saudis sent forces across the causeway there to help the king clamp down on the Shiite majority there for their peaceful protests. And so, but you make a compelling argument about essentially about a lot of things that I didn't know about the background. And it's funny because I looked up the Presidential Study Directive 11 that you were talking about. And I got purple links here, man. I got a New York Times article. I've got a thing from the Frank Gaffney, the neocon from the Center for Security Policy, demanding that the thing be declassified. He was always a hawk on the Muslim Brotherhood. He was not a Kaganite on the issue of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood whatsoever, and was on red alert about all this stuff at the time. And then there was a thing from the Federation of American Scientists that apparently I clicked on before, but doesn't have a hot link to the thing. I guess the thing has never been declassified. But so, and this goes to what I was saying about Liz Cheney. And I remember this about Liz Cheney was kind of pushing for this sort of thing. And I remember them talking about how Gamel, I think was his name, Mubarak, the son. They're like, well, we don't know what to do with him. He's not good enough. So we're going to have to figure out something else. And maybe we will go ahead and support democracy. I didn't remember them being so specific about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. But I know they were talking about that in Syria and including in the New York Times from the very beginning, from the Bush years. You can read it where Elizabeth Cheney, as they called her then, had a big fancy title. I document in the book, they changed her title 2 or 3 times. I think she stopped to have a baby for a minute and came back and changed her title again. But the whole time she's working on creating a Syrian government in exile, the Syrian National Council, which you previously mentioned here, which would inherit the power. And even though it was made up of the Muslim Brotherhood primarily at the time. So
yeah, so
that much
like
is certainly true there. No question about that there. That was their avowed policy then.
Yeah, and there was one guy, I think it was in the New York Times article about it. And again, these articles didn't come out like in September 2010 when all the meetings did and when the policy was set. The articles about this didn't come out until like March 2011.
Right, yeah, this one's late February or mid-February 2011 is the New York Times article about it, yeah.
And they didn't get much attention. And in one of those articles, there's a U.S. government official. Again, I apologize, I forget who, but basically he was responding to the accusation that, hey, isn't this just a policy to put the Muslim Brotherhood in power? And he basically said, well, if we can't, as the American government, distinguish between Al-Qaeda on the one hand and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other, then, we've got big problems, So he just came out and said, look, we are putting the Muslim Brotherhood in power. And again, that just changes everything. When you know about that, and you know about that policy, then you start looking back on events in Tunisia and Libya, Syria, all these places. It just changes everything. And again, I feel bad I haven't sent you that article about the snipers yet, but I'll double check over it,
Yeah.
in the next days and send it to you to publish. But that should hopefully, make the case much more clearly than me trying to describe it, from memory.
Yeah. Because I covered all this at the time, of course, on the show, and I was talking with people in Egypt who were even sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were terrified about the Americans. They said the Americans were doing everything they could to undermine them, and of course the Saudis and the Americans absolutely were behind the military coup to cancel the results of the Arab Spring there just a year and a half later and put, Fatah al-Sisi might as well be Mubarak's son in there. So if maybe they tried their little experiment and it didn't work, but at least there had to have been, for example, as I just said, between the neoconservatives, between Gaffney and Kagan, seems like there were also differences of opinion throughout the U.S. government and foreign policy establishment. And, one of the things they did was increase trade into the Gaza Strip and stuff like that and drove the Israelis mad. That was not what they wanted. So, but that doesn't mean that just because they do these things that they really know what they're doing or have a coherent policy or a consensus among all the different players involved about what they're doing,
Yeah, and I think regarding Sisi, like in Syria, for example, the Qataris originally were given kind of tasked by the U.S., the Israelis, and the Saudis to do the initial legwork of funding the al-Qaeda-led insurgency in Syria. And they were taking the lead with the permission of the bigger countries for the first 2 years. And basically in early 2013, the Saudis pretty much decided that the Qataris were messing everything up, that they were mishandling the file. And that's when a really important city in Syria fell, was Qusair in May of 2013. It was right by the Lebanese border. And that was how the Free Syrian Army and Nusra would get their weapons from the Lebanese side, was through this city called Qusair near Homs. But so that's the point when Prince Bandar took a bigger role. And again, I hope I'm getting my dates right, but there started to be basically the Saudis kind of said, hey, the Qataris, you guys are messing it up. You're not getting us the results we need.
I'm sorry.
And so the Saudis took over.
Just want to say that Prince Bandar you're talking about, that's Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the former head of intelligence and then former ambassador to the United States for Saudi Arabia, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Please go back and complete your thought. Forgive me for that. I just want to make sure people know who you're talking about.
Him, right? Yeah, Bandar Bush. So basically, he was made the head of Saudi intelligence, and then he ended up basically taking over the file of, running the insurgency, the al-Qaeda-led insurgency against Bashar al-Assad. That was Prince Bandar, who was basically behind all that. So there started to be problems at that time between the Saudis and the Qataris. And then later, again, I forget the exact dates, but maybe a year or two later, the Saudis actually put an embargo on Qatar. And then the Saudis, who had long supported the Muslim Brotherhood, all of a sudden the Saudis turned and called the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization and banned them. So with Mohammed Morsi, who took over, the Muslim Brotherhood leader who took over as president of Egypt from Mubarak, I think, I haven't studied this so close, so I could be wrong, but my hunch is that because of this, the Qataris, the Saudis kind of felt like the Qataris are getting too powerful here, and we need to cut them down to size, and so they went in and took out Morsi and put Sisi in his place. And then again, the Saudis took over the control of the insurgency in Syria. Mm-hmm. And that's, when the false flag happened in Ghouta in Damascus in 2013 with the whole chemical attacks. Supposedly Bashar al-Assad's army launched these sarin-filled rockets and killed more than 1,000 people in the suburbs of Damascus, and that almost triggered the Western intervention.
Hey, that was right after the coup in Egypt.
That was all Bandar bin Sultan was behind the false flag.
Yeah,
in Ghouta in 2013. So,
Well, you're right that was right after the coup. Now that you mention it, in Egypt, and that was also meant the false flag in Ghouta, which was meant to bring the United States into the war on Al Qaeda's side at that point. That was Bandar, working with Erdogan to do that, and because I already think Erdogan was in on it, but maybe not. But you're saying that was Bandar doing that to bring America in on Nusra's side, but to spite the Muslim Brotherhood? In what way? I'm confused.
Well, sorry. So regarding Egypt, when the Saudis started feeling like the Qataris were becoming too powerful,
Right. I understand
think,
that part.
I haven't studied it that close, so I could be wrong, but that's my guess as to why the Saudis went into Egypt and got rid of the Muslim Brotherhood guy, Morsi, who was backed so strongly by Qatar. They got rid of him and put Sisi in. I believe it's because, again, the Saudis, that's when they started having trouble with the Qataris and felt like Qatar was becoming too powerful. So that happens to be roughly the time that also the Saudis, specifically Prince Bandar, took over the file of guiding the insurgency in Syria, took over from the Qataris and took like a much bigger role. And so the Saudis started having more influence over the direct influence over the insurgency at that point. And that's too when this false flag happened in the suburbs of Damascus in 2013, which, as you mentioned, the idea was to trigger Obama's red line, where Obama said if Bashar al-Assad uses chemical weapons against his own people, that would be a red line that would trigger me to launch a big bombing campaign or invasion of Syria. So Prince Bandar is the one who, on the ground specifically, was working with a group called Jaish al-Islam, one of the so-called rebel groups. They're the ones that, from the best evidence we have, pulled off the false flag of that chemical attack. Obama later got cold feet and called off the bombing campaign, but the false flag did happen, and that was, again, to help with this effort of overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. So the point is, I guess, again, that just Prince Bandar, he's became very powerful in Syria at that same time that at the expense of the Qataris, at roughly the same time that the Saudis overthrew Morsi, the Qatari-backed Morsi, and put Sisi in his place.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I remember right from 2011, I'm almost certain it was Alistair Crook wrote in The Observer, which is just the Guardian on the weekend, I guess, that Prince Bandar has opened his jails and is letting all the mercs out. That would have been, I'm going to guess, March or April of 2011. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, okay, so.
But again, I guess with anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, you.
I was going to say, there was a New York Times article that came out, I think about that same time, I think in the summer of 2013, written by Mark Mazzetti. He's like a veteran Middle East journalist for the New York Times. And he wrote an article talking about, again, the U.S. launching this Operation Timber Sycamore to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and relying on funding and expertise of Saudi intelligence, specifically directed by Prince Bandar bin Sultan. And Mark Mazzetti used the phrase the Safari Club, which was, this old kind of like network of intelligence agencies that dated back to, I think, like the 70s and the 80s that did, probably some of the Iran-Contra stuff, et cetera. And so Mark Mazzetti wrote an article about this, saying like this is kind of reminiscent of the old Safari Club days, where you have this like several different intelligence agencies that all seem to kind of work together. And the Saudis were like a key player in that, basically doing things for the U.S. The U.S. says, hey, and I guess by extension, Israel is saying, hey, we need this al-Qaeda-led insurgency in Syria doing this, that, or whatever. And, Prince Bandar bin Sultan was the guy with like the connections on the ground and the money to get the job done. So that whole false flag, there's heavy Israeli involvement in it, like creating a bunch of the fake intelligence to blame Assad. The Israelis actually themselves were the ones that planted within the White House the idea of the red line that everyone later attributed to Obama, because he said in a speech, if Bashar, uses chemical weapons, that will be a red line. But that was actually the Israelis that introduced that concept and got Obama and Hillary Clinton to use it. So there was heavy Israeli involvement in that false flag. There was heavy British involvement. There was heavy French intelligence involvement, and there was heavy CIA involvement. So again, all these intelligence agencies, sometimes we think of like, well, there's this country, the US does this, and Britain does that, and France does that, as if they're like separate. And Israelis, as if they're separate, or Israel and the US are separate. But, it's thinking about it in terms of nation states is almost like not very helpful. It's more thinking about, hey, there's this like group of gangsters that all run these intelligence agencies together, which again, you could call the Safari Club, which Mark Mazzetti, the phrase he used. Whether it's Prince Bandar working with the Israelis, or it's John Brennan in the CIA, or it's Michael Morrell, the deputy director, all these people, work together to get these type of operations done.
Yep.
And that was the case with the insurgency as a whole, and then also with the Ghouta false flag specifically.
Yeah. The original reports from those who knew about what was going on in Syria were NATO is doing this. Eric Margulies came home from France, where he knows all their, foreign ministry officials from way back and their spies and everything. And he told me by like fall of 2011 that, oh yeah, the French are on the ground over there coordinating the war. It's their old colony. So they were taking the lead at that point anyway. And whatever. People can go back and check the archives. We covered all this in real time out, so it was unfolding the whole time. That, some of their propaganda about the brutality of Assad's war is true, and some of it only may be true, but boy, are they leaving out the reality of the other side. And listen, this, again, we did another entire interview on just the background to the thing, but let's end with the beginning here. What is the reality of the innocence and the peaceful nature of the protest movement in Syria? How legitimate was it? How widespread was it? How corrupted was it by snipers killing cops from the very beginning and all of those things? Because, look, it makes sense on just the face value thing here, to play devil's advocate here, that, yeah, dictators don't like it when people protest, and their stupid, clumsy cops tend to clamp down. And that can oftentimes really backfire, where what you really need to do is, if you're a dictator or just a regime, is let people protest. That's how you let, steam out of the valve to take the pressure off. And instead, he clamped down and clamped down and clamped down. And that's what created the insurgency. And then so is all his fault. And then the insurgents then were protecting the country from their evil dictator that was attacking them. And so that's the way they address the whole thing. That's the way the war party frames the whole issue. Now, I know you're going to differ with that, but I bring all that up to try to give you an opportunity to differ with that in some detail here.
Well, it's kind of all those things. And again, this guy, Jared Cohen, who orchestrated a lot of this stuff from the State Department and then later Google, in a speech he gave, I think at Stanford a couple years later, he described this as the dictator's dilemma. And the speech was regarding like Facebook and the role that Facebook played in the Arab Spring. And he said, look, when you have, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a dictatorship. It could be any government, but especially in a dictatorship, if you can get people protesting, if you can light the spark or get the snowball rolling, then the government has a dilemma on their hands, which is like, yeah, do we crack down on these protesters? Do we let them protest? And in the case of the Syrian government, they, in some cases, did what they should have done, which is just let people protest and stayed hands off. But then there's the case of the kids in Deraa that wrote on the wall graffiti saying that Bashar al-Assad should go. And there was the local security chief, Atif Najib, who detained these young men. And there was the rumor that Atif Najib's security guys tortured the kids and pulled their fingernails out and threatened to rape their moms. But those turned out to be exaggerations and were false stories that spread. But he did arrest the kids for a couple weeks, and so that made people in Deraa angry, and that kind of started the spark. And then again, if you introduce the false flag snipers and start killing protesters, then it snowballs from there. And the actual people coming out to protest, well, there are all kinds of people. Some are people who just want a democracy, or they're angry because they see that the government is killing all these people, blowing their brains out at protests, and that makes them angry, and so they come out and they protest. So there were some people who protested for very legitimate reasons, but also many of the protesters were not protesting for democracy and liberal, the Western style freedoms. A lot of the protesters were Salafis, and they were supporters of two different Syrian clerics who were based in Saudi Arabia. One was Adnan al-Arur, and another guy was Muhammad Surur Zain al-Abidin. And Muhammad Surur Zain al-Abidin was from Deraa originally, but he had spent like 20 years, guess where, of his life in the UK, living in London, like most of the Islamist guys do. And then later he moved to Saudi Arabia, but it was a lot of his followers in Deraa, and of this other guy, Adnan al-Arur, who was very famous for calling for the killing of Alawites and in some of his speeches, because he had a satellite TV show. But it was supporters of these guys who were made up like the backbone of the early protests. So there are some secular liberal people, some communists, some leftists, but a lot of them were Salafists and calling for an Islamic State and calling to, send the Christians all to Beirut and to massacre and kill all the Alawites, send the Alawites to their graves. So it was just a mix of all this stuff. But again, the beginning of it was people like Jared Cohen from the State Department and the CIA orchestrating these protests, understanding that there is this dilemma that any government faces. Like, if you've got a foreign intelligence agency trying to stir up trouble, it is really hard to, deal with it properly. Another thing to mention is that there were these internal documents that ended up getting by this NATO-funded NGO. There were these internal Syrian government documents that ended up getting stolen and brought out of the country. And this NGO claimed that they had all this evidence that that Syrian leaders, Bashar and all of his people in this emergency council that they set up to deal with the protests. This NGO claims that we have more evidence than there ever has been about these war crimes and these direct orders that Bashar and his guys gave to kill the protesters. But if you actually read the documents, which I've done, which Kit Clarenberg has done, wrote some amazing articles about this. Those documents actually show that the opposite, that these most of the people in the top levels of the Syrian government were saying things like, hey, do not fire on protesters unless they fire on you. Be careful. Don't agitate the protesters. They also talked about how they were worried about being assassinated because there were attacks taking place against government officials. So, it doesn't mean, again, the Syrian government never did anything wrong or there weren't any crimes committed on that side. But the point is, all of this was orchestrated, externally. And if you're a Syrian and you're just living in a place like Douma, like in the suburbs of Damascus, and you go, there are these protests taking place, and all of a sudden, again, people keep getting shot in the head. Of course, that makes you angry. I remember even talking to a guy who's now a member of HTS and the new security forces here in Syria. And he's from Duma, that city where there were some early protests in the suburbs, and where there were some false flag snipers. And I asked him, "Hey, what was your thoughts, early on in the protest?" He's like, "Oh, well, first I was with the government, and I didn't go out and protest, but then I, started seeing these people getting shot and killed, and that changed my mind. And then I ended up going to the protest, and then he joined the Free Army, and then he fought throughout the war and ended up getting on the buses and being sent to Idlib at the end." And spent 4 years in Idlib, and then returned to Damascus when Bashar's government fell in last December. So you can see that this is how these intelligence operations have effects on people on the ground, and how when, like you said, when I was reading about the Arab Spring when it first came out, I could have never imagined that this was really what was happening. I just thought, yeah, Mubarak's a dictator. We got protests in Egypt. My brother even went and was in a bunch of the protests to make a documentary about it. So he was there and saw a bunch of the street battles between Mubarak's security forces and the protesters. And at that time, when I was just, reading about it in the news, how could I have ever imagined or thought that all of this stuff was actually behind it?
Well, we were debating it
years later that I was, of course, through studying it and then reading interviews and people talking about it after the fact, that you can actually put the picture together. So if you're a Syrian on the ground and you're just seeing the protests outside your window and people getting shot, like how could you imagine that there's this huge external conspiracy going on to spark these protests and to destroy the country? There's no way. You'll just see the protests, you see people getting killed, and you're like, oh, you know what? This government is bad. I'm going to the protests. I'm joining the Free Army, et cetera,
Right. Well, a little distance will help you. And by I don't mean me. I mean, for example, I'm virtually certain that Daniel McAdams knew from the beginning that what was going on in Egypt was a put on, essentially, more than any other thing. And, Ryan Dawson, who's more conspiratorial than me on virtually everything, he was not on that. He was like, dude, this is way too many people from way too many parts of Egypt to be just the NED's doings and whatever, which I'm still pretty partial to that argument too. But there were people at the time who said, no, this whole thing is a put on from the beginning. People who, like you, are even suspicious of WikiLeaks even being, the whole thing being essentially orchestrated, not even in part, but in whole. Whereas I was very much from that point of view as far as it went in Libya and Syria. But as I was saying before, my idea was, well, the Arab Spring broke out as kind of this popular movement, and they exploited the hell out of it against their enemies, but clamped down in favor of their friends where they could, and did what they could to manage the situation, which I think maybe was overly complicated. And that you're right, that it's actually more simple even than that. But I'm pretty sure McAdams was right all along, and others who were more skeptical about it were right all along during that time.
Again, it was just hard when you see the images, all these people going out in protesting. And I don't really have an ideology now, but for most of my adult life, was an anarchist. And so I've been to a lot of protests, you know what I mean? For anti-war protests, for all kinds of things. And so in my mind, when I see these people in Egypt or elsewhere protesting, my first reaction at the time was like, yeah, hell yeah, go for it, protesters, and the government is evil, right?
Well, and America did look really bad because everybody knew that Hosni Mubarak was America's guy. He'd been in there for 30 years. Yeah. And on CNN and everything, it was embarrassing. It wasn't just a put on. It was like, geez, this is kind of the entire country is making it clear, apparently, that we were his only constituency, not them. Damn. And then the tear gas canisters said made in the USA on them. And it was a disgrace. And I quote in the book, I have numerous people talking about this is part of, and including Hillary Clinton herself, this is part of why we needed to do Libya, was because we looked so bad from Egypt, that he was so obviously our puppet that apparently they all hated and wanted rid of. So now we have to try to look like heroes on the side of the revolutionaries by really taking their side in Libya next door. And I have like 2 or 3 or 4 different quotes like that. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was a close advisor to Hillary, and Sarah Lee Whitson from Human Rights Watch, who she's pretty hardcore for a Human Rights Watch type. I've liked her on some things, and she was saying, oh, that was definitely the thinking, dude. That's what they were all telling me at the time, was we look bad for Egypt, so now we have to make up for it by going to Libya, which I don't know, man. These people are dim-witted enough that I could see that kind of thinking playing into them. In fact, I think Matthew Hastings reported I think Michael Hastings reported that in Rolling Stone in his Libya piece as well. The same one where Samantha Power is stuck doing do-gooder, rinky-dink stuff, and she wants, like, helping Iraqi Christians, and so she wants to start a war.
Yeah. So I mean, again, it's just it's extremely hard to wrap your brain around the idea that, like, Mubarak is our friend and we've supported him for a long time, and also we're orchestrating his overthrow. I mean, that's what happened, but it's not intuitive. It's like hard to imagine that.
Yeah.
Of course,
and we need to start another war for PR to make up for how bad we look for the last thing we did here.
Yeah. And I didn't figure out any of this stuff early. If Daniel McAdams, maybe I do recall him making some statements like that. I didn't figure out any of this stuff early. I was like, like at the time, just seeing it on the news, I was like, protesters, like I said, go for it. This is amazing,
Well, I don't even remember who.
But it was only much, much later when you really dig in. And again, just more information comes out over time. Like in the moment, you just can't know. All you can do is kind of guess. You can be suspicious and you can guess, but you can't really know. But only later, do you can you really know for sure where the information really is there. But then when once you kind of learn the playbook, again, these color revolutions and this and that, then of course when a new one comes up, you can be like, okay, well, now I've seen this. Now I've read this book before. By the time it was happening in Ukraine, I'm sure that was easier to like understand than it would have been, say, in 2011 with the Arab Spring. But again, I wasn't early on any of this stuff. I was late on a lot of it because, it just took me a while to figure it out because it was not. The propaganda is very sophisticated. It's extremely sophisticated, and it's not easy to wade through it all the bullshit, I guess you'd say.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about the playbook of the snipers. This goes back to the Kosovo War too. And there's this guy, I'd like to really get the inside story about this kook. He clearly must have been some sort of Israeli plant. Yosef Bodansky. Do you know about him? He was an investigator for the Republicans in Congress in the 90s for their counterterrorism committee in the House. And he wrote a book about Chechnya, which is not that good, but he wrote a bunch of articles about it that are very good, and about the U.S. and UK and Saudi supporting the Chechen, the second Chechen War, at least, at the end of the century there. And way ahead on the danger of bin Laden and Bill Clinton, working with him and all of that stuff. Really good. And then also I found where just after the Bosnia War was over in 1996, and it ended in 95, but he wrote this in early 96, I believe it was. And in early 96, he says, so here's what's going to happen next. 3 years from now, the Saudis are going to launch a war in Kosovo, and they're going to use the Kosovo Liberation Army there to launch a war against the Serbs. And it'll have to be a terrorist war and provoke a reaction from Milosevic and the Serbs. And that reaction will then be used to justify American intervention on their behalf. And he wrote that like in early 1996. And then this is exactly what happened. And the first thing that they did was they started sniping cops. And when you start sniping cops, next come soldiers. And when they send in soldiers, next comes NATO, crying that, just lying. Did I say crying? I meant lying their asses off. The Serbs had murdered 100,000 Kosovar Albanians and were going to kill the rest if we didn't get in there. And that was how they ginned up the whole thing, was shooting cops from a distance.
Wow.
And creating the backlash.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. That's okay. Yosef Bodansky is his book.
Yeah, and I have the quote in I have the quote in Provoked where he's predicting the Kosovo War 3 years before.
Wow.
And not predicting it.
Wow.
He's like, it sure reads like he's relating a conversation he had with people who have decided this. You know what I mean? For real. You know?
Yeah, it may not be a prediction. It might just be reporting.
Yeah, what has he got, a crystal ball? No, he's got sources, man. He's telling you, this is what the Saudis are going to do. You know, there doesn't seem to be much mystery to it. Anyway, I'm off track. There's so much here. You know what? I want to keep interviewing you because we barely scratched the surface of this, and I know that we've whetted everybody's appetite, and they're going to run out and buy Creative Chaos right now. It's right there on the Amazon, and I'm trying to get a hold of my guy and turn this thing into a Kindle for you as soon as possible. I know he has it, but he's a very busy guy. But I'm gonna figure that part out. But I want to take time. I'm in between. Well, I always have a lot going on, but I really want to try to find some time to breeze through this book so that I can ask more informed questions and maybe cover some of the later sections in the book and really inspire people to get it. It's some of the most important and interesting stuff. And what can I say, William? I'm just living in the past. It's always the Obama's dirty war in Syria years to me, just like it's always Iraq War II. And it's always 1993 and all of these things. I'm not getting over it yet. So I want to read more of your book. I want to interview you about more of your book. And I want to insist, please, everybody go out and get this thing, Creative Chaos. Where is it? How am I going to read the subtitle when I don't have it? Oh, here it is. Creative Chaos, Inside the CIA's Covert War to Topple the Syrian Government by the best guy on this, William Van Wagenen, and also find his great archive at the Libertarian Institute as well, reporting from Syria. Thank you, William.
Hey, thanks, Scott. And again, I'll send you that sniper article and again, to give you a little bit more detail about the Arab Spring part. But again, appreciate you having me on the show. And I love just having the conversations. It's really so nice to talk about it. It's really fun talking with you about all this stuff. Since, of course, you lived through all this stuff and know all about it. So it's really a pleasure to talk to you about it. So I appreciate it.
Okay, cool. Well, I look forward to doing it again soon. And thanks for being part of the Institute and letting us publish this masterpiece. It's really another feather in my cap, even though you did all the work here.
Right. Well, no, thank you for publishing it. That's I feel very lucky. I appreciate it, man.
Thanks for listening to The Scott Horton Show, which can be heard on APS Radio News at scotthorton.org, scotthortonshow.com, and the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org.